Michelle.
Daniel.
OG Rose.
So the other day we kicked down the door into Javier's YouTube channel.
Doing
a live. Spread across the couch, demanded chips and guac, and started throwing comments and questions at him about everything he was trying to do. And Cadell Last came in, Davood dropped in. It was like a party, and it was about family. So we actually, it was like an embodiment of it, because it was a family. So it all came together, so it felt appropriate. So that's the magic of YouTube Live. But it was on family and uncertainty.
I guess he wasn't certain that we'd all be...
Yeah, he didn't know we would come, so it felt kind of uncertain. But, it embodied it, because it was uncertain what was going to happen, and then everything came together in a beautiful and magical way.
Absolutely.
So uncertainty can, give rise and emerge as something beautiful. But, we got into some of the challenges of family, some of the wonders of family. Then we got into distinctions on being in family and returning to family, alluding to David Hume, and kind of maybe a little, that kind of return. What does it mean to return to family? If we follow Hegel, you're never ever at a place you don't return to, because there's really no understanding of what that at is. You don't even have a grasp on its constitution. And so, what does that mean? You can get into that Hegelian phenomenological journey and all of the different psychological and existential tensions that are around family and all the obligations. So what is it? What does it mean? What is family? How should we approach it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very, very important topic. I'm really glad Javier got the ball rolling on talking about this. And it was great to see the live brainstorming with Dr. Cadell Last and you, and I'm glad Davood popped in. I think he'll enjoy it. He'll get to
absolutely
enjoy it as well. I think that the question is really so pressing, because it makes me think, the year-end talk that you had with Dr. Cadell Last and the other gentleman.
Yes.
At one point, Cadell mentioned how it seems like there's this question of communitas, right? Like where are the rituals and the kind of shared space, the shared meals, all of that, that kind of keep us very grounded and embodied in our actual physical selves and locations. And he said something along the lines of like that family could really be a good solution for that. At the same time, many have unfortunately been through hardship in their family units, and that makes it more challenging to return to that.
Oh, sure.
Or to think of that as really completely a solution to...
It can sound crazy.
Right. And so I was thinking about that. That's so ironic in a way, right? Like that family is both the problem and the solution.
Right.
And we're all here because of some form of family, some aspect, even if, it's always between man and woman. And it's always usually in the context of family.
Sure.
And, flesh comes from flesh. It's miraculous, actually. In being a mother, it's firsthand, and that's a miraculous experience. And so I do hold hope for the family.
Sure.
I just think that it's kind of a what to do now, right? Like what to do in moving forward and having hope and breathing hope into that unit, if you will, or context, with having been through things that make it feel very hard or challenging or even scary to kind of embark on that as the solution. Because if you think retrospectively, you think, well, okay, and depending on the person's circumstance, it's a sliding scale. Some people have a very idyllic childhood and some do not, and so family has such an impact on us. It leaves a lot of people with both joy and sorrow, depending. Oh, sure. But there can be some traumatic things about it, or just very puzzling things that you just feel you just have no idea what to make or what to do of it. I mean, Javier mentions the helplessness often that you feel in a family context, because sometimes there are just issues or problems or things that a family member is dealing with that you just don't know how. You can't help them. They have to help themselves, and yet they're still your family, so you care for them. And so yes, I think that's kind of a spread of my thoughts on it, but I do think that's why it's such an interesting question and so important to understand what to do now, what to do.
Well, I mean, what constitutes a family shifts between cultures, the structure of it, what it looks like, so on and so forth. I mean, there's a lot of conversation now about family. There's a sense in meta-modernity that community is needed. And you have all these shows where it's kind of like Friends and, Fast and the Furious. We're not just friends, we're family, kind of idea. Where
I'm so glad you just...
that was my, was it Vin Diesel? Yeah, that was my enactment of Vin Diesel. It was so close, so accurate. And there's this idea of trying to it's almost like you're groping in the dark, trying to, what is this family thing we're talking about, this familiarity? Well, there's this idea that we always start as individuals, that we're born and that we're just you. And it's true. I mean, you can never inhabit the consciousness of another person, but it's very interesting that in the human condition, you were born already relating. Already in a relation to, if we've, directly the mother. Especially if you're thinking breastfeeding or just coming out of the womb, you're right there with the mother.
Yes.
But you're also, especially before technologies that are starting to make possible, different forms of becoming pregnant, you're also relating more indirectly to the father that calls you pregnant. So you have this direct relation you're already in, and this more, I want to almost call it invisible, kind of more discreet relationship with the father. I mean, he's there, but it's not as physical, it's not as tactile as the mother. So you are thrown into the world already kind of stuck in your consciousness, in your mind. And obviously when you're just born, you're not aware much of anything. But as you grow up, you're aware that you're stuck in your own mind, but it's in a mind that's already presented a kind of mystery. And what I mean by that is the mystery of what is the meaning and nature of this relationship I found myself thrown in. And what is it between the mother, which seems kind of different than the relationship with the father, which is kind of discreet, and the father has different expectations. And then there's a relationship to both of them at the same time, kind of a third dimension. And so the human identity finds itself arising already presented with a kind of mystery. One, it's kind of like, why can't I actually, it's funny enough, I remember having a particular freak out when I was 3 years old because I realized I could not look at my own face except in a mirror. And I just thought that was just so, like, why? Why was the world such that I could only look at my face through a mirror? Because the mirror wasn't my face. I just thought it was the craziest thing. And so, I was like, it's like, why can't I just, like, jump in someone's head and look at myself? And it drove me. It's like, it was one of my, I remember this vividly. In the upstairs room on the floor, I, for some reason, had a box of Corn Pop cereal. And I was, it was shaking. Yeah, I was not happy. I was sad. But it's this idea that you're already presented with this kind of limit to what you can know. And you're stuck in yourself, and you're presented of what is the meaning of this relationship. And it seems to entail obligation, but it also seems to entail security. It tends to entail a reference point that is always going to be there. It's, in a sense, your first fact. I am born from I am born is almost your first fact, and I am born in this way, in this family. It's kind of the foundation of your being, in some respect. Well, what is the meaning of the foundation of that being?
Yeah.
What are you? It's interesting because when we talk about the foundation of a building, we know that the building would fall without the foundation.
Right.
But when it comes to humans, it's not so clear that if you never spoke to your parents again, you would fall apart. Right? They are, in fact, somehow foundational to you, but it is not clear how necessary they are to you. But then, of course, we know all of the countless studies that show that when kids grow up without their parents, that has significant impacts, usually, quite usually, say, in the Wilcox Marriage Foundation, and things like that. So there's this idea that it seems like you can withdraw from it, and not have a connection with your parents as you grow up, but then also they're somehow foundational to you. So it's quite mysterious. Also, you'll hear of people who say are born missing a parent, often, and they'll have this feeling of something missing, like they don't know who they are because their dad isn't there, and they'll go on these searches to find their father. Or they're adopted. Their original dad. There's some sense that you don't know who you are unless you know your father, which feels foundational, and yet it's a foundation. Whereas if a building pulled itself off its foundation, it would fall off. A human can theoretically move away from their foundation and still keep going and still be themselves. But the question is, should they? Is something lost if you lose the family, and therefore you need to return to it? Because there's also this issue of helicopter parenting, where if you never leave your family, there seems to be some failure to develop properly. If you don't
have some element of letting go.
Yeah, well, if the parents don't have an element of letting go, that's empty bird syndrome and all that different stuff. But also, if the kids never move out into their own and develop their own autonomy, that has problems as well. They don't develop correctly. So it's this very strange balancing act, you see.
Yeah, no, it's I mean, everything you're describing makes it very, I mean, there's just so many complexities to it. And the question of kind of who am I mean, I think about from a child's perspective, or at least the best that I can do is think of my own and, you know, observe from our children. And it's kind of like, I think there is something that's so, you aren't necessarily thinking about like, who am I, or what is myself, or whatever. You're just kind of existing and absorbing a lot of what's around you. And that will, though, become a big part of how you behave, or what you do, how you think about things.
Right.
And I guess it's like, it does feel like, you know, there's all of that, but there's also the coming to one's own will and starting to find their own place in the world and push boundaries a bit, figure out what's really their capacity that for the child. And it's interesting because I was thinking about how sometimes some people feel almost like ambivalent, like, oh yeah, this is like to their family members, as in like almost, I used to notice this like when I was a little bit younger, like, oh, like it's almost as if that person could just as easily be like a stranger to them, even though it's their, and I'm like, I wonder why that is. And I think, though, that sometimes that can happen, though, because, well, one, maybe I'm just misreading them. Maybe they're just kind of quiet, but really they have a deep, profound care and love and connection to, you know, let's say their mother or their sibling, and they just don't express it the way that I maybe would have or something. But also, I wonder, in that push, it's like in that place of the child finding themselves that often creates some of the tensions there. And that's also to be said, I think, for a husband and wife, actually, which is weird to compare that because they're already adults, right? But you really kind of do die and have like a rebirth in marriage.
Oh, sure.
You really do. I mean, it's kind of like you, in a way, you have like this whole new life that you've never had before. And so you're sort of kind of coming to find out who you are in that. And I wonder if a lot of the tensions that arise is like this, like kind of like not accepting or kind of pushing back hard in a bad way against that coming to terms with oneself, whether that's parent to child or husband to wife or, you know, wife to husband.
Oh, sure.
I mean, I guess it just reminds me of Rilke. I just love Rilke.
Sure, yeah.
You know, where he says how you have to basically protect one another's solitude.
Yes.
And I think that's really important for the parent to allow that for the child, and for spouses to allow that for one another.
Well, I mean, the issue is that if we follow like the Hegelian dialectic, you have it. Two people, when they quote unquote become one, they don't cease being people. And you see a lot of times what happens. So there's a lot of people can talk about the family as if it's the family, as if the individuals are not there. And so there's there's an effacement as opposed to a negation that occurs if we use that language. And so you have a lot of things. So you have people in the family that have never they're living in regret because they didn't pursue their dreams, or they're upset at work and they use the people in the family to run for themselves or to fill various lacks as opposed to learn to live with those lacks, to use that language. And precisely because family members can never escape being family members of one another, even if they never talk to one another, there's still some kind of, there's a connection, there's a relation. That is your mother. Well, that's a very interesting thing, because that can be used as a safety, that can be used as a security, but it can also be used as because we're connected, you can't escape me, so I can unload all of my neurosis and problems on you, and you're supposed to, if you love me, take it and deal with it. And you see, this is very problematic, because it's almost like you kind of have this Christ idea where people's like, oh, you're going to forgive my sins no matter what? Oh, well, let me just send all, let me just load it on you. And that's, Bonhoeffer's cheap grace. You're not supposed to go, oh, well, Jesus will forgive us no matter what, so let's kill him or do whatever we want to Jesus. Let's abuse him because he'll ultimately forgive us. It's almost like that can happen in families, where there's this idea that, everyone has to be here with one another, so there's no incentive for us to do our best to overcome our neurosis or raise to the occasion, and then it becomes a family of quote-unquote cheap grace as opposed to costly grace, as Bonhoeffer described, which is the idea that everyone is doing their best to quote-unquote be alone with their solitude, as you put it, to be loving, to try to understand one another. Because, you know, the other thing that causes so many troubles in relationships, we were talking about this at dinner, as Chekhov talks about, is hermeneutical problems. You know, they're often attributed to emotion, but it's actually like just people that love each other are constantly misunderstanding one another. It's a hermeneutical issue in different frameworks of understanding situations. Well, you want to have grace in the family or relationships so that people can figure out those hermeneutical differences, versus say, oh, well, we're in family, so there's no incentive to solve those hermeneutical differences so that we do better, because you're going to be a member of the family no matter what. Oh, and if you're upset at my inability to figure you out, well, you're in the wrong, because you're supposed to always love me because I'm a member of the family. So there's that relationship that is inescapable that people can use for cheap grace as opposed to costly grace, which then can lead to all sorts of neuroses and problems.
Oh, absolutely. And I think this, it reminds me, right. Because Javier had mentioned about how the word family is related to familiar, and therefore it's about, like, you know, kind of like how Deleuze would be kind of on guard with sameness.
Sure.
There can be a risk there where there's a kind of it's actually the fact that we take for granted, basically, like we kind of have the sameness and the basically therefore not anything, like it's expected, right?
Yes.
It's all kind of just expected because it's going to be the same as it is today, as it is tomorrow, as it is the next day, that we're family, like you're saying, right? And so we lose the kind of, I responded kind of with this idea of like a sweet strangeness. We forget we lose the sweet strangeness that then kind of revives life and into those relationships.
Oh, yes.
Okay, but the thing is that I think one of the best hopes that family has, because again, I do believe there's really much of a solution in family, but there's also a lot of hard work that needs to be done in the inner life, because, you know, we're also, Javier had mentioned how, like, with Samuel Barnes and you in your conversation had talked about how, like, philosophy makes things strange again. Mm-hmm. And that's it. I mean, a big part of, that's like it, but that's also the beginning of it.
Sure.
Like, as in philosophy and thinking through things, really starting to deconstruct your own thoughts about X, Y, or Z, dealing with your neuroses, you know, is going to be such a big part to at least having a chance for hope in the family unit. Okay. You know, no one's perfect, no, but at least you could try to do better than what you've experienced, or do your best, the best that you can do, and dealing with the inner work, doing the curious work, I think is helpful.
Well, you know, is the family there, because you're talking about sameness, so is the family there to make sure everyone's always the same and like one another and they never change, because then that's death. You know, sameness is always an effacement, because there's no such thing as there's actually no such thing as sameness in reality. So no two things are actually the same. So if things are toward in their orientation sameness, then they're toward effacement. And the family can do that. It's like, you're not the same as you used to be. You know, there's this idea that you want people to be
kind of the emphasis on same.
Yes.
And there, you know, there can be some in the general sense, not the exact sense, because like you said, if it's exact, it would not, you know, it would be effacement. But in the general sense of same, that would be, like, there are some good things to that. Right. Sure. But there's only, it's again, like, it's something we talk about a lot, Daniel, where there's always something good and bad, right, about things, or, you know, hard but rewarding, basically. And so if we have to think about same in its kind of tragic sense as well, right? Yes,
I mean, there's a big difference between saying, oh, you used to like dancing and you don't dance anymore, and acting like that's a problem, and saying, it used to be that you understood that hard work would pay off and now you don't work at all. You know, there's a difference between, like, a sameness where you're saying you used to have a hobby that you liked and you don't do, and then making the person feel guilty about it, and then a sort of, hey, wake up, man, you know, you used to work really hard, now you're down, you know, you're upset because you lost your job and you've lost hope. There's a difference between a family that is holding people to a prior standard and making them feel like they should never change from it, and a family that is encouraging you to make the most of yourself. You see, there's a difference between the family that is trying to encourage each member in their individuality, in their aloneness, if they're alone per se, to make the most of that and to become their full self, and for the family to be an incubator of that, versus the family be the structure of no one... it's almost like the family becomes a thing to make the most of itself, like the family itself. But the problem with that, of course, is that the family is not a living thing itself.
Exactly. And that's the thing, all of the work is the impetus, it gets put on, like, and this is how it is, like you're saying, people then think the family
is a thing,
is the kind of like, is the incubator for getting better, being better, right? So you just release all your neuroses there.
Yes.
And it's kind of like, maybe it could be like, you let it out, and hopefully that's just, work it out. But honestly, you never really actually deal with the neuroses, because that is an inner work.
Yes.
That is an inner work. You can't just like release it out there, expect it not to impact anybody, and also expect it to change.
Right.
Well, okay, maybe you feel better for like a week or two, but then again, it happens again, right? Like, and I think like, it's just like you're saying, it's so important, that kind of the saying about, no group is as strong as its weakest member, or something like that. Like the idea of the group, it only has individuals in it. It's the group itself. Like, you cannot put your finger on that. You cannot. So you can't, if you want to make the family stronger and do it to the best of your ability, then you have to do your best.
Yes.
And then trust. I think there's because I think there's a fear. Well, if we don't like kind of work it out in this kind of bubble of the family, then we're not really like caring, or we're not really doing the work.
Yes.
No. So I think it feels like there's nothing really there. You have to kind of trust when you do the inner work, and then it's like you just have to trust that that's actually going to actually downstream kind of do the work to make the family at large be better. It's almost like I think there kind of can feel like a leap of faith there, but it's I think it has to be done.
I think there's a big difference between family as a signifier of a kind of relation and using it as a standard.
Right.
The problem is people are using family as a standard.
Right.
Like a standard of judgment or a standard of value, where you're saying, oh, we are a family, therefore what you did is wrong, because that isn't what this kind of family does. That sounds fine, but you're going off and being an artist and like, well, this is a steelmaking family, and you're not doing the family's work or whatever, right?
Yeah.
That this family functions as this kind of standard of what you're supposed to live up to. And the problem with that is the family, in not being a thing with substance in of itself, because only individuals have substance, well, then it's too vague of a concept. It's too vague of a thing to mean anything on its own, and so it ends up just being the projection of who's ever mentioning it at the time to be a fill-in for what they want it to be a fill-in for.
That's not the quote I wanted to say.
What quote? Oh, the weakest member?
Yeah, that's not the quote I wanted to say.
That's okay, it kind of worked.
I don't know if it worked. I mean, it gets across that, each member is what makes the whole, but that's not the quote I'm trying to say.
I mean, are you going to pull the Margaret Thatcher, there's no such thing as society?
Maybe.
Dostoevsky, I loved humanity and lost the ability to love an individual kind of thing.
Yeah, there is a phrase, but I don't necessarily, because, the idea
the
of like...
the family is no stronger than its strongest member, maybe, the individual, because you want to put the emphasis on the like individual.
The family is no more existent than its individual member, or something like that.
Michelle Rose Opperman Garner. January 2020.
No.
No, you just quoted it. The family is no more existent than its individual members. That works. There's some ontology in there.
Sorry, guys.
No, it's fine. I took weakest member to mean in terms of substance, in terms of ontology.
Like essence, like presence or something.
Yes, it totally.
I'm sorry.
Totally
I don't. Thank you. I don't be quoted being like, she's that girl with that line about the weak family member and how everyone's...
An ontological substance.
You are the weakest link.
No, it's ontological substance, Michelle. It made sense.
That's like the older brother in like the Prince of Egypt movie. Okay, no, sorry. Anyways, so yes, the point is though that when the family is going to be stronger, when each person does the work to help to work at themselves, to make themselves stronger.
Yes.
And a lot of times that can look not as invasive, like within the group. And so I think it can look like nobody's doing anything.
Well, but that gets into a bunch of different things. It's like, it looks like most of the time when you're letting the flowers grow in the garden, it looks like you're not doing anything.
Exactly.
But you go out at the key times. I mean, 90% of the time, and you're not doing anything in the garden. Like, of the day, 90% of the day, if not 98% of the day, you're not doing anything, and yet that allows flowers to grow, but you go out to weed and water and do it at these necessary points. There actually is a large amount of time where family members should leave each other alone, but there are also critical times where you need to know that your dad has your back. You know,
yes.
there's, you know, if I were to describe very generally
yes.
what a healthy family relationship
Please
is.
do.
Well, it's one where everyone's like, I got your back. You know, I got you. You know, if you're in a foxhole, I'm in there with you. You know, I don't, you know, it's like, I don't understand why you're writing all these stories. I don't understand why you like doing this job, John, or whoever, Bob, or what. I don't, you know, that's what you do. That's your thing. But if you need something, or if someone's after you, they're going to have to go through me. Like this kind of relationship. Or if your brother, you know, your sister does something, you don't know why she doesn't see, but it makes her happy, and like, okay, and she calls up and she's like, man, I really need some help, and so you go over and help her. Like, you have their back, as opposed to like a relationship of making them feel like they owe you something. I mean, it's like you make them feel like you've got their back, as opposed to make them feel like they owe you something.
Yeah. Well, I think that also comes to the trust, right? You know,
sure.
You extend the trust to the family members,
yes.
and you don't hold some sort of record of.
Well, I mean, a lot of people enter all this nonsense. They play this game. It's like, it's like, oh, they haven't called me in 2 weeks. It must mean they dislike me, or it must mean they don't care. You start playing this game of deciding what it means. The meaning crisis. It's a form of that, where it's too much meaning. It's like, no, you trust them. They are your brother. You trust them. They love you, they care about you, and it doesn't matter if they call in 2 weeks or 5 years or whatever. You know that if you called them up, they've got your back.
Yeah.
There's that knowledge that they've got your back, and you've got their back, and you're there for one another. And that's that. And that's a healthy family, where it's not based on owing, guilt,
yes.
obligation. Because very often when family members get into the thing of saying, well, you didn't call me in 2 weeks, they're dealing with some neuroses. They're dealing with some security of their own that they're that rather than do the self-work of figuring out what that is, they blame it and project it onto other people and make it their problem. Because what if
they're just like, well, no, I just really like you. I really love you, and I like talking to you.
Well, then you call them and don't bring up anything about guilt or obligation or whatever, because that's
the thing. So much of these, you know, ethical machine guns, like we talked about.
You just don't use the ethical machine guns. Yeah, if you want to talk to your brother, here's the thing: rather than you go, why haven't they called me? You go, I'd like to talk to them, and you call them. Like this game of going, well, it's their fault. That's where it's no good. You take the initiative. You make it happen. You take the action. You do the returning, as opposed to you expecting them to return to you. Right. You know, to return to family, first off, puts you in your response. You do it.
Yes. Yeah, and I think another key thing. So you said, I've got your back.
Yeah.
That's huge. You know, if you ever need anything, if you ever need help, I'm there for you.
Yeah.
I think another thing. You know, I think about my childhood, and I feel very blessed to have very loving, very caring parents.
Yeah.
And I think, and siblings, you know, close with my siblings, especially my twin sister. I think about, too, another thing that probably stands out to me about what could be a good trait, or what could be a good trait for a family, is unjudgmental presence.
Yes, absolutely.
I think that's very key, because especially when you're dealing with little ones, and you know, like, we're talking kind of as adults, right? Adult family member relationships, but this applies to that too. Like, whether you're talking about parents to children, or parents to adult children, or adults, you know, siblings to each other, or older siblings to each other. Just kind of like, if you're in the same place, and often people do appreciate a warm body and company, sure. Right? Not that it should come with some expectation or whatever, but it will naturally happen in a family as you raise children, and you know, whatever, you have family times when the family's with one another, sharing in tasks or whatever, is to have unjudgmental presence. And I think offering that, where it's like that, and also when people just, if you are engaging with each other, and there's just that sense of attention, like the person actually listening, you know. Yes. I mean, this makes for great relationships in general, friendships, etc. But I think it's always like, that's something that's so valuable. And I think, though, that does tie into the curiosity, where you just remain open. You kind of are just curious. You're listening, and you're genuinely interested. Just whatever is being shared, you know.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think that can be really important too.
Well, I mean, you know, there's a few things. So there can be this feeling, you know, why does the family get an obligatory kind of like obligation structure? You know, there's different forms of obligation. There can be the obligation of we're all on the same wrestling team, so you signed up for this, therefore, you know, you signed up for this, therefore you are in some respect responsible for training as hard as I do so that you win your match and we all make the same amount of points and do our best. So there's a certain like obligation there because you signed up for this. And that's a fair thing because you chose to be part of the wrestling team, and therefore in a way, you have chosen to submit yourself to the obligation of training hard. And I am kind of justified to expect you to do that because your score affects my score and you chose to be here. But the issue with the family is it's this weird thing where the children do not choose to be born.
Yes.
And yet it also is like you take care of them, right? So it exists in this very interesting kind of moral space.
Yes.
Where you take care of the children, so then are they obligated to help you or to do certain things for you? Well, maybe to some degree. But you
also birthed them.
Birthed them into the world, and they didn't ask to be born.
Exactly.
You see, a lot of the problems of kind of the ethical, where people get messed up on the ethics, is they only remember one side of the equation. Like the parent will say to the kid, "Well, I took care of you, therefore you owe me X, Y, and Z," and they forget the fact that the kid didn't ask to be born.
Exactly.
So you got to remember that side of the equation so that you have an ethical balance where you can say, "Okay, I took care of them." So I can expect them to not throw a baseball through the glass door since I have to pay for that. You know, there are certain expectations I can have that are
kind of boundaries
that are reasonable.
Right.
But I'm also not obligated to guilt them when they're 45 years old to come visit me every Sunday because I raised them and I took care of them. It's like, well, if you're supposed to trust them and know that they want to see you and that they're going to come see you, and you kind of forgot that they visited you 3 times last month. It's just that, you know what I'm saying? You start forgetting things, and
children, whatever age they are, they shouldn't be under no obligation to like make the parent happy.
No, they can't. I mean, it's not. Yeah. And that gets into the problem of people looking for family to fill, their problems. Yeah, and I mean that right there. It's just an easy target for when you in your own life encounter your quote-unquote lack or incompleteness or the finitude of the world, all that stuff we talk about in the philosophy of lack. It's just very easy to then thrust that upon family members, precisely because they are stuck being your family. They can't quote-unquote escape. So I think that becomes a natural thing to do, whereas if you do it at work, you could lose your job. One of the things, too, that's interesting to me is that I was saying earlier about thinking about family as I got your back and you help one another, deal with, get through life. Well, I mean, until 1950s, living and surviving was really hard. And I think it was more natural and easier to think about family in those terms. And I think in terms of we survived together. Yeah. We were there for each other. We're going to help each other get by. In the same way that Freud kind of warned that psychoanalysis would become more pressing as you became a first world nation, you became richer, it's almost like you have the psychoanalyzation, I guess, of the family, where the family itself becomes more psychological, it becomes more existential.
Yeah.
And so people are thinking about family in terms of what will, quote-unquote, make them whole, or where they'll find meaning, or where they'll get a partner, as opposed to, basically before the 50s and formula and birth control and you're on the frontier, if you're going to have sex, you're going to get married. If you have sex, you're probably going to have kids. And also you have to survive the environment. So the family unit was deeply linked with a being human. It was
exactly.
It wasn't something you now people oh, do you want to get married? Do you want to have kids?
I think before there was a real sense of we're going to have to.
Unless you're a monk.
This is what
unless
you're
a
do.
religious institute. Yeah.
Sure. But this is what we're going to have to do to kind of to survive, like you said, to survive. And to keep going, really.
Yeah, and of course it's a generality, because you can always find exceptions.
Yes.
But you see, whenever there's an introduction of choice, there's an introduction of psychology, why I chose this. And so once family became more chosen and having children became more chosen, people then go, well, why did I choose to have kids? And then when if they don't have meaning in their life, then they blame the kid for not providing the meaning.
So yeah, no, absolutely. I was thinking about this probably yesterday. Just, it'd be really interesting too, because okay, so just to go back a little bit, it's kind of like, I think there's something that feels so vulnerable in the fact that children, they don't choose who they get to, what family they get to be born into, and that that can feel difficult, because you're like, well, you just hope to God they are, know, in a loving, nurturing, respectful kind of family. Now, I think at the same time, the more we value, I guess I'm just thinking about this inextricable link between the sanctity of life, the child is, because they're vulnerable and they didn't ask to be born, there's almost like a mercy you want to have towards their existence, and realizing that they are acclimating to this whole new world. And so a gentleness and I think about from a maternal perspective, there's just this almost mama bear protection that you want to have over your children. Obviously they will grow and they will start to do more themselves and one day live their own lives. But I guess I'm thinking about this, and it makes me wonder if what degree was the family, has family gotten harder as it's gotten smaller on the whole?
I think it's,
you know what I'm saying, because when family was just kind of inevitable, you knew it was inevitably
large.
Well, it would it's probably there'd be at least more than one or two kids, you know what I mean? And it was, I just wonder about that. Is what would be, if you could do some sort of it would be very interesting to me.
Well, I think the number before the 50s, a lot of people are having 5, 6, 7, even more. 4. They're having 3. One child is unheard of.
Yeah, it certainly could have. Of course it
happened, but it was unlikely.
Yes.
And there is something about a single child, and then you get into the tiger mom, that seems to lend itself in the direction of being your hopes and dreams. You're putting so much into it because it's your child. Where once you get to more than one, especially if you get into the 4s and the 5s, where you're just they really are different. They really are their own people, because you see how different the personalities are between them,
how they relate to each other.
Yes, because and also you can't form multiple children to quote unquote be like you as successfully as you can a single child who doesn't have a relationship between other children, let alone a network effect between 5 children, to arise to a very unique identity. Yeah. So it's easier to form them.
Well, I think the thought would be, I think there's this ironic flip-flop, actually, because I think there can be there can be this kind of concern, well, we just obviously kind of established how complicated family structures can be. So wouldn't it feel risky to have that be even more complicated with more people, right?
Sure.
At the same time, though, this would be kind of where my question comes in with but has it necessarily gotten any better? To lessen the number of interconnectedness. Does that make sense? Because it's
it could.
I'm not saying necessarily that it's not it.
Well, there's a bunch of things because it's a great question because
you would think that families are doing that if it's somehow that maybe less possibility for friction or conflict because of less people in a family or something, that somehow family drama should just drop like a rock if people on the whole are having less children.
It's a very valid point because it would seem that way. The less people would seem
but it seems the opposite, right?
Well, because
at least it seems like family drama is very common.
Well, there's a few things.
Okay.
First, I should note that when we talked about being in family versus returning to family, in some respects, this idea of the family being this place where everyone is there for one another, I got you back, is a return to an idea of family that is less psychological and psychological. It's a return
almost more tied to the land.
Yeah, it's more tied to a past. It's returning is kind of going to a past idea of the family. And then also there's another meaning of the phrase, which is going to be tied to Hume's journey, where you go on the family, you go off, you learn your way and you return, and it's not overly attached. And then the Hegelian phenomenon. So the function of the word return there has many things, but it's an idea of you have to leave the family to return to it in a manner where you are your own person, where you went off and you made your own person, but nevertheless you come back to these relationships that may sometimes make you feel like you're not fully understood, because when you go off to college, you come back to family, you've changed, and then it can feel like they don't fully understand the way that you've changed. But then the key is that the family respects those changes and don't make people feel bad for them, and still maintains this idea that I've got your back, which I think is important. Whereas this kind of being in family could be linked with an idea of trying to find rest and wholeness in family, to make it, be this place where you don't feel lack, you just feel whole. But of course the problem is that sort of being becomes an effacement, not a negation. So we brought those phrases up at the beginning, and we'll note them here. To the point that you were saying about large, well, we have to, the only way that family is not large, generally speaking, is through birth control.
Yeah.
Once birth control is introduced, then having children is a choice. And generally speaking, even if you're a Catholic, you chose to be Catholic, or you choose to stay Catholic. Once the technology is introduced, once choice is introduced, psychology is introduced radically. Yep. Existentialism, psychology, all of that goes together with choice. And so you have a correlation here where the number of children and the introduction of the changing of the meaning of a child into a choice also goes together. So that's number one. And whenever more psychology is introduced, then there tends to be more neuroses.
Absolutely.
So that would be the first thing. Now, one could argue, well, that's an opportunity to face that neuroses. Well, sure, and that gets into where we need to learn to integrate with lack, but that means everyone has to be philosophical, and so we can say that now.
Right.
But why we have gone through generally all this trouble, that would be to start. Second, the less you have of something, the more attached, the rarer and more scarce it is. Yeah. And so when you have one child, that is your child. And so you become really attached to it. And it's precious. It's rare. And you can say, well, all children are. Well, when you have one child, that is your child. And so it becomes more difficult to get a healthy balance, the right balance between distance and closeness.
Whereas not necessarily, but that's probably very likely.
Yes, we're always talking about probabilities.
Yes.
You will always find it's a distribution curve.
Sure.
Whereas when you have a bunch of kids, the parents have to simultaneously relate to all the children while making the children feel like they're equally related to, not one's overly related to. Mm-hmm. And so, and that's going to necessarily, though, mean you can't relate to all the kids at the same time always. So they're going to have time apart, but they're also going to have time with you. So it kind of lends itself more naturally in a kind of balance. And the children themselves have to learn to negotiate who they are different from their siblings, which forms which requires a sort of formation of identity and a security in that identity, because they know that they are distinct, and they're distinct. There's multiple levels of distinction as opposed to the distinction between them and their parents.
Yes.
Which, if there's only one gap per se, it's easier to close or to project over, which causes all the trouble.
Right.
Whereas if there's 5 gaps, and each one of those gaps creates its own its own unique set of conditions and principles and ways of being, well, then the process of individuation, I think, is more likely to occur, thus helping people find that right balance between attachment and individualization. Also, too, if you're having a lot of kids, then that means there's a lot of work to do around the family. Around the house. There's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of clothes. There's a lot of food. Yeah. There's a lot of stuff that needs to be done. So you don't sweat the small stuff. You don't sit around thinking about, how that person didn't talk to me, enough.
Well,
you're working.
It's like that little bunny cross stitch that your mom has.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. It's like those little bunnies, like a little bunny family on the wall. And it says, families that work together and play together stay together.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there is something about that where there's more work to do. There's more hands to do it. My mom will always say, many hands make light work.
Yes.
So you learn to do that work together, and you know, just kind of like less time to worry, like you said, about you know, making sort of big giant judgments or ethical machine gunning people
as a very.
I mean, this is maybe it's ideal. Maybe it sounds idyllic.
No, well, again, a return to family is basically a return to that. There's something about if we're talking about how the family should operate, and of course, it's a generality. If the family is bringing in more psychological problems, more existentialism, more feelings of loss of self-worth, it's doing it wrong. The family is supposed to really be a unit that is focused on, dare I say, the surface, work, doing the dishes, getting by, taking care of, whereas the deep is where you move to the individual, in the individual journey, and that gets into the, you know, the horizontal and the family is more of a horizontal thing, whereas the individual is vertical. Yeah. Now, the family, your father is standing at the garage and having conversations with you about, you know, things and telling stories can certainly help you develop vertically, but the family then is facilitating your vertical development. They're not trying to replace your vertical development.
Absolutely.
And that's the difference. The family should be helping you on your horizontal life. You know,
and that's kind of the the simple aspects of the communitas that were talked about in that talk, the great talk you guys had.
Yes.
You know, basically, really like the sharing of the meals, who needs to can we chop wood, you know, the things that just the stuff that needs to get done around, and then there's the sitting around time, maybe playing cards or whatever.
Yes, and all of that is going to have an impact on your quote unquote vertical development, but it doesn't try to replace it. And critically, members of the family do not make their vertical development your problem. By putting guilt on you or obligation or making you feel like you're doing something wrong. Yes. They're in the business of helping you develop yourself, as opposed to lassoing you into helping their development.
Yep.
The family can be there to help you learn how to be alone with alone, but the family should not make the other people feel like their individual aloneness with aloneness is the problem of one another. And that's where but it's so easy to do that. Here's the problem. Precisely because they're there. They're stuck in the house. They're stuck always having a relation to you. It's like a temptation. It's just this easy thing to do. It's so easy to do.
Low-hanging fruit.
It's
easy to point out.
Making your problems, the problems of family members, is a low-hanging fruit. It's easy to do. It's uniquely easy to do. Because if you did it to your coworkers, you may lose your job. If you did it to your friends, well, they're not. They can easily go away. They can walk away. But your family is uniquely positioned to have a constant necessary. A friend can be your friend today and tomorrow not be your friend. Your dad is always your dad. You know, family members are always that relation. That doesn't mean they're close. They're always close to you. That doesn't mean they're always like, you know, you can, of course, alienate your family. But the nature of the relationship cannot change. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
Whereas friends can be your friends today and not your friends tomorrow. Co-workers can be your co-workers today, not your co-workers tomorrow.
Right.
But your family must always be your family. But precisely in a very ironic way, that necessity of relation then makes it a tempting way to escape your neuroses and to escape your problems and to not face yourself and to just carelessly project what you're dealing with onto them. And so, but then of course that leads to all the trouble.
Yeah, I was thinking about how the family is always there. It's this interesting place where the family has to be. You have these relationships that you actually, in a sense, can assume. You can assume that your dad will always be there, but there's also this you actually have to also in that same space. It's almost like. I know. This is just an example. When I was younger, and my brother was just, you know.
Your brother.
My brother. You know, just brothers.
Sure.
He'd bring out his turkey calls and, you know, do his turkey calls in my ear. You know, just things that brothers do, teasing.
Sure.
And things like that. And I would think to myself, I'm like, would he do this to a girl he liked? Would he do this to a girl he liked? Would he do this to someone out there in the world? And I was like, he. In my mind, I was like, he shouldn't do that. Like, he would never do that to a girl he liked. He would never do that to someone, like, he just met. And it just was always so strange to me. I mean, although, honestly, by and large, you know, me and my brother, we're fine. We just, normal sibling stuff.
Sure.
And there were a lot of, you know, kind, fun moments, too, with him.
Sure.
But the thing is that, like, I always thought to myself, and my mom would talk to me about, have conversations about how, you know, this is like, the family is... almost a training ground. Like if you can't treat your family member with just simple decency, kindness, you know,
yes.
Like I said, unjudgmental presence.
Yes.
Doesn't have to even be conversational necessarily.
Yes.
But then how, it's almost like it would feel very kind of, I don't know, cheap to be able to do that with a stranger, you know?
Oh,
like,
yes.
so I guess what I mean to say is, like, it's weird. You have to treat your family like family, but almost like somebody you just met, and you would show them some etiquette, like politeness, things like, you know.
But that's
the weird thing about it. It's like you have to kind of treat your family like they're strangers and they're from family at the same time.
Well,
if that makes any sense. I think in order to maybe have a chance of like that being a good space.
That's everything. That's the return to family with the RE in parentheses, where it's this returning, but it's arriving for the first time. It's this bothness. In a way, every individual, who, no matter who they are, because you never access the mind of another person, is in fact a stranger to some degree. There is a bit of that strange, and it's so interesting how we naturally are polite and kind to strangers, and how it can be so easy to be mean to the people closest to us.
Absolutely.
But if you really actually take seriously the fact that the people around you are unique individuals, that can almost introduce this healthy way we treat strangers. You know, this healthy way, because you say, oh, that's like the only person who will ever be that person. You know, that, you know, I can't, there's a holiness there, there's a sacredness. Yeah. You know, C.S. Lewis, Way to Glory kind of thing. Like, it's like your dad becomes, Jim is the only person that will ever be Jim, and I can't ever access his mind. Yeah, he's always my dad. But then there's also a uniqueness, an individual. It actually really does help families to view each family member as their own unique individual that you can never fully know. Because that introduces a healthy level of, like, unfamiliarity. You know, there's this, there's this necessity of relation you can never escape, but there's a healthy level of unfamiliarity.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's why I think the familiarity and the unfamiliarity they actually need to kind of have a healthy coexisting in order for that relationship to probably be, at least, you know, for that relationship to be able to thrive, really.
Well, and getting back to the meanie cry, there's a funny way in which, and Javier has mentioned this, like, families make themselves miserable by spending all the time thinking about what it means that they're family members, as opposed to just saying, oh, that's Michelle. Oh, that's Daniel. Like, that's my sister, and therefore I'll be there for them. I'll fight for them. But actually, you start tearing down all these social superstructures.
Exactly, and that's the kind of thing. Like, it should almost be simple to do that, shouldn't it? Because it is like we said, those family members will always be. You know, that will always be your father. You can kind of just like, okay, so we know that. Like, we don't need to spend so much time. It's kind of like how also with the actually what Javier was talking about today with, like, these synthetic analytical, it's like there's not much added there if we just kind of try to hash out over and over again, like, what should he do for me if he's my father? What should he do? You know, Not that there aren't just natural things that family will do for one another, but it's like if you just focus on that, you might make yourself end up making yourself kind of miserable, because you're not really there's not really a space for then the natural kind of just organic manifestation of that relationship.
I mean, again, it comes back to the uniqueness of the ethical situation, where the parent says, well, I raised this child, therefore there's an obligation, but you have to balance that with the fact that the child did not ask to be born. Yes. Basically, you should never impose obligations on anyone but yourself. If you want to obligate obligations should always be contained. Once you start obligating other people, you have introduced really poison into the system.
Absolutely. And I think that's hard for I think for most people that's like, but that's anti-family in a way.
Well, that's the problem.
But it's kind of like, but if you don't hold obligations over people's heads, they're actually like so much more free, so much more able to just like breathe and relate to one another.
Well, if you take the Christian logic, God does not die on the cross. You know, God does not die on the cross because he's obligated to you. It's grace. It's pure grace. The logic of relationships is one of mutual self-sacrifice. Well, it's like self-sacrifice, self-serving, where you sacrifice yourself for other people, but you do not obligate them to sacrifice for you. And also, you can't come to the place where you can be a good sacrifice unless you integrate with lack and make yourself the most of an individual. Right. You can't self-sacrifice, serve other people, be a good member unless you've also done the work of making the most of yourself and overcoming your own neuroses. So you get this double action. For David, you go on this big philosophical journey to develop philosophy, only to return to common life where people basically don't appreciate all the philosophical work you've done, but you're in a position to protect them from the totalitarian regime that will come in to manipulate them, that you can stop because you have philosophical skill. So it's only because you go on this journey that you can then serve and protect people with something that they may not fully understand, but you're able to do that. And they simultaneously respect you for it and serve you in different ways. You may not know how to be a blacksmith. They do. You need a blacksmith. Well, they're serving you in that way. So you switch from this thinking of obligation to mutual self-sacrifice from a place of excellence that is based on grace. And mutual trust.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think too, like, we talk about this a lot, and I remember, you sharing this idea with me first, that if you want somebody to, if you are like, well, I wonder why that person doesn't want to, like, spend time with me, well, get more interesting, become more interesting, and don't, like, you don't go and obligate the other person with your need for that person to spend time with you. Become an interesting person, become desirable, that they will want to come and be with you.
Yes.
And I think, like, I think that's kind of a beautiful thing in family or with it, or outside of the family, though, too, where the beauty of it is that, like, I'm here if you want to to cohabitate or whatever, coexist here in this space or doing whatever.
Yes.
But there's no sense that you must, or else, kind of. And maybe one could be like, well, then, like, is it bad to have, like, family dinners? Like, does that obligate everybody? Well, look, when your children are young and you need to make sure they eat, it can be helpful to have rhythms.
Yes.
Rhythms of this is when we eat.
But that's all linked to solving problems, not an ethical system. The problem is we will be hungry if we don't, so we sit, we have dinner at this time, and we sit and we... There is a sense in which you are obligated to find food or you die.
That's true. You're obligated to breathe, right?
There's something about material reality that imposes obligation.
Yeah.
When you're older... offering to have a family dinner is perfectly fine. But if you load it up with guilt and if you don't come, you're a bad person.
Sure.
Well, then that's... funny enough, what that ends up doing is make family dinners not feel like family dinners at all.
Because you're kind of like, well, now I'm here, but, like, I know you would hate me if I weren't.
Yes, it ruins it.
It does. It really does.
But that is where, when you put the obligation on you, you say, make yourself more interesting.
Yeah.
Well, then you put the work on you. And if you do that work, you're going to feel better about yourself, and people will want to see you more. And if you do that work and they don't want to, or they don't talk to you more, well, you've now advanced and made yourself more interesting, and you've attracted different people, or you found different things. And so you really want to put the impetus on the self-work. And the family needs to see itself in terms of each member having each other member's back in their self-work. We're going to be there for your self-work. We are going to help you in that self-work. We're going to incubate that self-work.
Oh, absolutely. And
we cannot do your vertical for you, but we can, on the horizontal, help you avoid unnecessary obstacles, protect you, defend you, so that you can do good self-work.
Absolutely. And I think, too, like, that self-work is also what's talked about with children, young children. Yes. As they basically, like, you're modeling.
Yes.
So when you're doing your self-work and they witness that,
yes,
you might still sort of scratch your head and be like, gee, I wonder if, like, I'm teaching anything, or I wonder if anything, like, or if you're having a rough day or something, like, oh man, like, has that, like, not clicked or something?
Right.
And it's like, I hope I feel like I'm doing this every day, but maybe it's not being seen or something. I don't know. Like, in terms of maybe how some sort of life lesson or coping with something or whatever. Handling big emotions, for example. But it's like, but you just keep doing it. You just keep going, and you keep doing the self-work and trusting that will make an impact. Like, your living life is kind of like a testimony to maybe the things that you hope to make available and cultivate right in your family at large, in terms of values, in terms of stuff like that.
Well,
and I think like then you just kind of, so I guess I'm just saying, doing the self-work is always beneficial, because one, like you said, it actually benefits you. First and foremost, it benefits yourself, which is great. And then it benefits those around you, because they see that. Like, people witness that in one another. And that inspires those around them.
Yes.
to also want to do the work.
Well, and that was a key word, because there's a big difference between obligating and inspiring.
Yeah, absolutely. I just love the word inspire.
Yeah, it's
like with its connections to the breath, right?
Yeah.
It's like it's a breath of fresh air, right? You know,
Yes.
that's I think what a lot of times
breath of life. Yeah,
people want to feel again in their family is like, like we're good, like we're like this is like a breath of fresh air.
Well,
would be so kind of revolutionary in sometimes the family tense drama situations.
Well, and this gets to the key phrases. There's no family that people don't want to return to. There's no family, because if they don't want to return, that means they don't want to be there. you have not inspired them. The connection, the relationship is nothing more than one of biological designation.
Yeah.
Doesn't have anything else. So if you're just in the family, being in the family, it hasn't been tested, in a sense, to know that the family is actually beyond just a biological designation.
Right.
They can never leave, and maybe they're not allowed to leave because you're guilted, or people have their neuroses, they don't want to face, so on and so forth. The true test to determine if a family is something more than that is if people return to it and want to return to it, not just the holidays, not just some kind of obligatory thing, but look forward to it.
Yeah.
Because if they do, that means that inspiration has happened there. That means that people have helped facilitate one another's self-work. The return is the test. The return is the way that you find out if you did something more than simply share blood.
Right, absolutely. And, my little sociological questions to do some sort of like mass study across time, which would be impossible, but obviously it's just kind of conjectures, like just kind of ideas and questions, because I don't know for sure if like families of the past that maybe tended to be a little bit bigger just in number were less drama filled than families today.
Sure.
But I do think there are other factors, like you're saying, like with what type of work were people doing. Yes. A lot of times it was much more hands-on type of work. Yes. Now we're in our heads a lot more with the work we do. So that can contribute to it as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, it's all more existential.
Yeah.
I mean, the big thing is that families are kind of pressure cookers. All relationships are pressure cookers. And pressure cookers...
you can make some really good food.
That's what I was about to say. You can make great food, but it's also pressure. It's good and bad. It's kind of this idea, again, in Dante.
It can explode.
Yeah, well, Dante, the only way to the heaven is through a purgatory. You have to purge yourself. You have to clean yourself. In families and relationships, the problem is we tend to think of families in terms of what's going to make you whole. Fulfilling you, when really it's going to perfect you.
Yeah.
It's going to challenge you, and it's going to... But
there is something fulfilling in that. In like you feel proud in a sense.
In that vertical self-work. Yes. But you see, that idea of family and relations as quote-unquote purgatory. So yeah, I mean, the entire idea of like a return to family structure, that requires this schema of thinking about families helping one another be alone with alone to do vertical work.
Do you think that somebody can go on a human journey while still physically being in their home? Like,
I mean, that's a great question. I can't say that's impossible, but it does seem as if there's something about the very act of having to find your own place to live, being in a foreign land, not knowing anywhere that might be necessary for the development of the individual. Sure. I mean, with the internet, it's imaginable that we can have encounters staying home that you couldn't have otherwise. But there is something about the leaving that seems kind of critical. And look, I mean, if you look at all the traditions, stories, religions, whatever, there is this kind of the child goes off. There's this expectation that that there's going to be a journey and a leaving. Now they may come back to the family because the families are deeply tied together. But I mean, that even could get you, I guess, into the loss of rituals, these different masculinity rituals, or these kind of parenting, these that are not here anymore, that helps designate, at what part of your life are you in the family, and now you need to return to the family, or a transition point, or in a different kind of relationship to the family. I guess now it's mostly marked with getting married. Like once you're married, that's kind of understood to be a change. But then, people are putting off marriage later and later, and, so... And then I think the designation is probably different between getting married and having a child. Then when you have a child, it's like you are your own full family unit. the break, feels. And there's a funny sense in which you return to family by having a child, because now you've returned to you've made a new family. In that very act.
Yeah, I was thinking about this. I guess we're talking about, in a sense that we're talking about like going into your adulthood and then encountering the world, and then kind of understanding the role of family now. That makes sense with with what's being said on the human journey. I did want to say one other thing though, really quick, about the family. Another trait, we talked about like having someone's back, unjudgmental presence, and I guess this could technically maybe just be like a little addendum or whatever, like a little bullet point underneath.
Sure.
Unjudgmental presence, but I don't know, I was just thinking about like my relationship with my twin sister, and how close we are, and how wonderful of a relationship that is. And I think that a lot of times it's like just feeling like completely and utterly accepted for like who you are. You kind of don't have to like make, just that ability to feel comfortable, and at ease. And I think that does have to do with not feeling like you're going to be judged if you do X, Y, or Z. Like you can be silly, or you can be serious or whatever, and you're just accepted.
Well, and that's for
who you are.
There is something about the proper family atmosphere that just feels that kind of acceptance, where you can't mix up. You talked about the eggs. I always like that phrase, the eggshell phenomenon, where families can feel like you're always walking on eggshells and can do something wrong. Well, if indeed the family is there with the idea that we're trying to help facilitate each member's realization of their full potential. Well, realizing your full potential requires experimentation. That means being able to explore, and that means explore freely. So a necessary attribute of that atmosphere is to make people feel like they can just do whatever, that they can do what they want, and that they will be accepted, because they are trying to find themselves, or they're just trying to say what comes to mind or what they're interested in, and they'll say something funny because that's what came to mind. So acceptance is also a kind of environment of experimentation, and by experiment, I don't mean you trying new things, but where you're just able to try being yourself per se. And and that's going to be a characteristic of a family that believes its job is to help facilitate each member to be their full selves. Because in an eggshell environment, then the atmosphere has to be obligatory. It has to be based on worrying about what people are always thinking it means that you do X, Y, and Z versus, A, B, and C. And so there's a nervousness. Where there's a constant nervousness, that's antithetical to the space needed for an individual to realize themselves.
Right, absolutely. And I think that, obviously you may have boundaries, like let's not smash the dinner plates or whatever. But so we'll be like, well, what are you just gonna accept if people are smashing dinner plates or something? I don't know.
But that's also based on a physical reality. You smash a dinner plate, there are little shards all over the floor that people can cut their feet on. So it's like, that's different from you should call me every 2 weeks, because that's based on a mental, psychological reality.
Right.
Obligations that are based on, hey, you shouldn't plow the car through the garage door is based on the, reality of the garage door.
Right. And the thing is, too, like, it's funny, bless her little heart, our little girl, she'll ask me, like, say she did something that I just asked her not to do or something, and I'm like, well, okay, Grace, we're not going to do that. And she'll feel really bad, and I'll be like, and then she'll be like, Mommy, do you still love me? Even if I do something, like, something I shouldn't have done or whatever, or, like, did something dangerous or whatever it was. And I'm like, of course I'll still love you. I'll love you forever. And I give her a big hug and a big kiss, and I tell her, I love you forever, sweetie, Yes. I don't want you to get hurt, but I will love you forever, always.
Yes.
No matter what. No matter if you do the thing or don't do the thing, I will love you. And I think that's what I'm talking about, where you have this sort of sense of, I accept you, even for your faults, I love you regardless. And that kind of just, you can just be sure of that. I think that's what helps to feel comfortable in the family dynamic.
Yeah, when Grace does something she's not supposed to do, the self-guilt
just
overwhelms her.
we're not even making her feel bad about it, but she feels so bad about it.
It's like the weight crushes her. It's like, no, what have I done?
I know, and then she needs lots of hugs, and
it's like hugs and kisses. It's like, I took a bite of ice cream before breakfast. I'm so sorry.
I know, bless her heart.
You know, we will. It's really funny that she does that, but no, it's well, when families will say, well, we'll always love you. But what ends up happening is there's this kind of move that they do where they say, but because you always love me, you will do X.
Yeah, it's so weird. It's almost like love becomes a complete force of destruction.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, yeah.
As especially as people get older. I mean, when people, it's obviously it can. There's always a risk for that at any age. But it's weird because people are like, of course I love you. I'll love you forever. And that's why I'm going to make you miserable.
It's like, of course I'll love you. It's almost like this, like, of course I'll love you forever. You thought you could escape? You thought that, and that's horrible to say, but there is a kind of like, the unconditionality of love becomes, I don't want to say meaningless, but there's this kind of thing, it's kind of like, okay, yeah, but you yell at me.
Yeah, exactly.
You make me feel like garbage.
Exactly.
It's like, I know you love me, but do you like me or something,
Exactly. I think people are like, gee, if this is love, like, I don't want any of it. I think people get to the point where they're just like, that's why they get kind of bitter, and they can get, like, distanced or this feeling of dread or whatever, because it's like, and then you kind of feel almost ashamed because you're like, well, I should just accept that that's their love for me. But it's like, that love, it's like our papers on on love, and like when things are out of love.
Yes.
I love that phrase of yours, Daniel. Yeah. It's brilliant because like it is out of love. Yeah, it's outside of what love should be.
Yeah. And
I think we have to get strange again with what love is. Let it be new to us time and time again, because love. If love is really going to be like loving, then the person should feel to some degree understood. The person should feel to some degree a sense of grace.
Well,
understanding. Like,
well, understood. They need to feel like there's something under them helping them stand.
Exactly, and like they're supported.
I've got your back,
loving.
Sort of thing.
Yeah.
Well, basically, what we're describing, where love becomes, well, we've mentioned before that truth, beauty, and goodness need the other three, or they become a force of destruction.
Right.
Beauty is bad without truth, because then it's like coherence without correspondence. It could be used to manipulate, to control. Truth without goodness and beauty just becomes empty syllogisms and facts that don't mean anything. But then goodness without truth can just be good intention that causes, a totalitarian regime with its utopian visions. So you have to have all three. And likewise with love, love has to embody truth, beauty, and goodness. It must have them all. Right. And if it has truth, and that's ultimately I think what happens to a lot of people, well, it's true, I love you, okay, but does it have goodness? Does it have beauty? Because if not, then it becomes disembodied and it becomes inhumane, unhuman, because truth without goodness and beauty becomes just like math. It's not human. And so you have to have all of the elements. The problem is that basically any obligatory based family structure, any family ethic that is not primarily in the business of helping each member be their full self, almost inexorably must lead to those kind of situations you're describing, where love becomes a burden, where love becomes bad, because it has to be. Like,
nobody wants to say that, but often people do feel a sense of.
Yes.
Or you can just see it. Maybe you just see it in.
Yes.
Relationships or.
Yes.
You'll probably find it somewhere, unfortunately, where there's this kind of a suffocation in love.
Well, because if there's a kind of idea that the family comes first, and in fact the family, quote unquote, doesn't exist, only individuals, then what comes first is a thing that doesn't exist, and so everyone's trying to make themselves into the image and likeness of a thing that is not there, which is necessarily an effacement. And once that effacement occurs, well, then you get all of the neuroses and problems that result.
Right, exactly.
And so the issue is, it's kind of like with family, there's no middle ground. Well, I'll take this with a grain of salt, but there's kind of a sense where there's no middle ground. Like if you take the Christian God, you're either in heaven or hell. Basically, I mean, I guess you can get into that limbo space at the beginning of Inferno, but taking that aside, It's basically like, it's heaven or hell. And likewise with family, there's almost a way in which it's either really great or it's bad. Now, I'm not too sure about that. I don't want to take that too far, but there's something about family that it's really important to get right.
Yeah, certainly.
Let's just say that. It's really important to get it right, which if you don't, the consequences are dire. Like, they're bad. Oh, yeah. But if they're good, then you've got people that got your back. That's a big deal. You got people that got your back.
Yeah,
you need people to get your back.
And you even have the potential for very deep friendships actually within your family.
Well,
when I think when that love especially is tied to freedom.
Well, in the same way that you get a very special relationship between, soldiers that go to war together, wrestling on the same team, because we've been through some stuff.
Yep.
We were there for one another. No, Jim over there loves paintball, and I don't like paintball, and I like reading Heidegger and German idealism, and he thinks I'm nuts, but frick, man, when it comes to we've got each other's backs.
Yeah,
we've got each other.
It's interesting you said soldiers. I busted out the OED because I like to do that. Looked at family. Couldn't really find its etymological, if it's from Latin, or I couldn't really find that. But what I did find is that basically it was used as a group of servants. That's what that's one of the first uses of the word.
A group of servants.
Yep.
Wow.
And so what's interesting to me about that is that does speak to this idea of working side by side in a sense, there's a serving that happens in family, one another, but also in a sense your service, if we think about it from this would have been, I don't know, hundreds of years ago when this first use of this word, but definitely a service to God, as well.
Sure.
That you are all kind of understanding that's kind of that the role is to kind of do the best you can, basically, basically do the good fight the best you can besides these people.
Well, and maybe that's fantastic. I mean, that goes back to this kind of mutual self-serving without expecting to be served.
Exactly.
Grace kind of idea.
It's you're all you can't put one of the family members as servant to you. No, you're all servants.
Yeah, so that's right, and you
Exactly.
don't expect only expect something of yourself to the other.
Yes.
Not expect the other to you.
Yep.
This thing. Well, again, if we go back to the family on the farm 150 years ago, the parents are serving the kids are helping the parents in the garden, everyone is serving one another. And after the 1950s, basically, there's not so much of a need. You don't need the kids to go out and help you in the garden because you go to the grocery store. The parents don't need to serve one another as much because a lot of manual labor for taking care of the house is taken care of by the electrical heating system or whatever. And I wonder if there's something about where we still almost instinctually or maybe on a collective consciousness still kind of feel like we're supposed to be serving one another. And there's not as much things to do because of technological advancement, so then that servitude becomes obligation.
Interesting.
We're like, well, we're supposed to serve, so that, what is it? But there's nothing to really, there's not as much to do, so maybe we're supposed to be obligated to one another. And so, because there's not the manual tasks,
absolutely,
it turns into psychological obligation because there's still an instinctual feeling that you're supposed to be serving one another. But there's not as many things to serve through, so then it goes into the realm of the psychological.
That's really interesting, Daniel. And also, I was just thinking, where it talks on trivial, right?
Yeah.
As the education system too has taken over. And
do you have the right answer or not? Yeah.
Right. But also, there's something kind of sportsy about it, right? There's
Absolutely.
something about gamification about
Absolutely.
it all. And so, you think about serving in terms of a volley.
Yes.
You serve them the ball, and then are they gonna? They better serve it back so you keep playing.
Yes.
Right? This is why the bunnies cross-stitch is important, right? Because it's work and play.
Yes.
It's not just play.
Yes.
It's not just work. It's both. And we don't have the work together aspect so much of family anymore, really.
Well, and if you...
I mean, not depending, but...
Well, yeah, and if you've got this kind of sense that some kind of volley's going on, the kids help too in the garden, so then you help, put them in the bath, it's kind of back and forth, but then that's not there anymore. You volley with statements and words or obligations. There's a volley of, well, you obligated me to come with you to the movie theater, so I'm going to obligate you to come with me to the to the sports thing. And there's this kind of volleying back there, and there's this sense of in the trivia paper, which I think it does indeed apply here. There's this idea that a smart person is the one who can answer the trivia question, right? Who has the right answer.
Right.
Well, likewise, there's a kind of trivia in relationships. The person who loves you is the one who does the right thing, who knows what you want to do in the morning, who can answer these kind of trivia questions of what constitutes a good relationship or what you like. So it becomes a trivia environment. If you really cared about the family, you would have done X, Y, and Z without anyone telling you X, Y, and Z. You would have gotten that trivia question correct. So I think that dynamic develops there as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, yeah, no, I was just thinking about Postman now. I'm thinking about TV.
Oh, sure. Well, he talks a lot about how the outsourcing of the familiar work went to the television.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's, it's like everything is trade-offs over time. Yes. It's just things, like you're saying, it's like things don't really, they just kind of shift somewhere else. And so we kind of end up doing it, but like in a wonky kind of almost...
Well, it all becomes psychological and existential.
Right, like we kind of like with this idea of the servitude and the working together and the labor, and it's like now the labor is all is like you're saying, psychological, and ends up just being a mental health issue for a lot of people.
That's what
and that's challenging, but that's also why we're having this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, because
let's kind of hash out some.
Well, I mean, if you it's kind of like a lot of things that if you don't think about it and you get them wrong, the consequences are dire. So, figuring out the difference between being in family and returning to family. And again, you want to inspire people to want to return to family. Absolutely. And so on and so forth.
So again, I think that inspiration versus obligation
is big.
It's big, yeah.
But anyway, I mean, this is a reply on family to Javier's. Again, we just kicked down the door, forced ourselves into his conversation, and we'll... Cadell Last, Davood, maybe we'll have like the family symposium. So our contributions,
that would be so cool.
Because I think it's an important topic, and well, it's the first. You find yourself. You don't just find yourself thrown into the world as an individual. You find yourself thrown into the world, facing a mystery of the other and yourself and your relation, and we all trying to figure that out. So I think it's an important topic. So
absolutely.
So thank you, Michelle.
Yeah, you can find Javier's talk on his YouTube channel. You can find our work on Medium on YouTube as well.
Cadell Last.
Yes, Dr. Cadell Last also has a great YouTube channel. Davood as well has a great YouTube channel.
So it's a blast and an important topic. So thank you for your time.
Yes, thank you.